So now that we've talked a little bit about Graham Greene and his kind of writing style and the kind of themes and context that are used in Brighton Rock, I want to really jump into introducing the kind of layout of the novel. So, Brighton Rock is considered, or Graham Greene himself considered it to be, he wouldn't have considered it to be one of his more serious literary endeavors, as it was classified originally as an entertainment or as a not necessarily a novel of literary prowess. And he did this because he considered it to be a thriller, a detective story, if you will. And that kind of goes back to his time spent in the Foreign Office with acts of espionage and all that kind of thing. But I digress. Brighton Rock is at its heart a kind of, it's not a murder mystery in the sense that we don't know who committed a murder, but it is this detective story that deals with crime and the criminal element. One kind of really good description of the novel comes from Cedric Watts, and he describes, I think, Brighton Rock really beautifully when he says that it is corrosively negative, grotesquely nightmarish, and cynically black comical. It is a thriller, a detective novel, a moral come theological paradox. It offers realism, expressionism, and satiric stylization. It is hauntingly memorable rather than fully convincing, but it takes us into darkest Greenland than any other of Greene's novels. The real Brighton is repeatedly inflected into a Brighton which is a garish hellgate. So, at the heart of this story is this kind of, as I said, this thriller detective novel, but there's so much more underneath that cursory look of being this kind of thriller. So, the first thing that I want to address particularly is the narrative point of view of this novel, because it it takes a while to get used to, because we jump around from character to character. And you guys are familiar with the conventional kind of uses of either first person or third person limited, third person omniscient. And writers choose these narrative viewpoints for whatever reason or another, but they typically stick with one to kind of use it as a way to, I don't want to say manipulate, or yeah, maybe I do mean manipulate how we view or see the characters. And Brighton Rock differs from this kind of traditional narration. And if you think back to when I was talking about Graham Greene's writing style and his kind of use of this cinematic camera lens, each section of our novel, each chapter of our novel is episodic. It's like a different scene from a film, so to speak. And that's purposeful on Greene's part. And you'll notice that in each of these sections, we get a different perspective. We really only get the insight of either one of three characters. We either get Pinky's perspective, Ida's perspective, or Rose's perspective in any given section, with the exception of part one, chapter one, when we follow Hale, and this kind of brief part where we follow Spicer and Dallow, but nevertheless, most of our information is limited to one of these three perspectives. And we are granted this access to the thoughts of these characters, to their feelings about others, to what we find out through dialogue. And Green does this so we can essentially see the story through their eyes. There are also brief moments of the narrator slash author's objective description of the scenery or explanation or commentary, as if he was kind of like this bystander. But on a whole, we see the story through these limited episodes, and it's up to us to put that information together. Part of the reason Green uses this narrative point of view is to emphasize this idea of insider outsider, misunderstanding, and to really reinforce that these characters come from very different worlds. And by giving us access to the thoughts with explanatory comments, Green enables the reader to not necessarily, in some cases, sympathize, but not necessarily to like any of our characters, because I will see what you guys think as you read, but none of these characters are particularly likable. But he doesn't mean for us to really like them. He really wants us to understand them and understand the world that they live in. So that is kind of an insight into his narrative point of view. So don't get confused if you're like, I can't follow this consistent narrative thread, because there really is no one consistent narrative thread from one section to, or not necessarily narrative thread, but a viewpoint. There's not this consistent viewpoint from one section to the next. We really kind of have to piece all of that together because we follow different characters at different times. So the other thing that I do want to mention really quickly is the title of our novel. Brighton is a place in England, but Brighton Rock is not. It is not a place, but instead it is a type of candy. If you think about are kind of like Myrtle Beach or Virginia Beach and the saltwater taffy or something like that, something that's sold on these kind of touristy places. That's what Brighton Rock is to Brighton. And for particularly in the 1930s, in the public's mind, it Brighton is very closely associated with these sticks of candy. They're like straight candy canes that have these emblems or pictures or phrases or whatever that go through the whole stick. Like if you bite it at this particular place, you see this sign or this image all the way down. But Graham Greene chooses Brighton Rock as the title for two reasons, and one of the reasons I'm not going to tell you about because it'll give something away. But the most obvious choice for the title is that the candy Brighton Rock is his analogy for human nature. Ida, Arnold, and Rose have this conversation about if people really change. And Ida says, no, it's like those sticks of rock. Bite it all the way down, you'll still read Brighton. That's human nature. So it's kind of his analogy for people, and it really opens us up to the question of whether or not people change, or if what's written metaphysically on our souls is always there. So Brighton Rock is you'll see the other reason why in just a second, or not in just a second, but by the end of the novel you'll see the other reason why. But Brighton Rock is a type of candy that would have been seen also as a luxury item for these tourists. So, and keep in mind, every time you hear or see Brighton Rock or Rock Candy or Stick Rock or anything like that as you read through the novel, because it pops up subtly here and there, and you should keep your eye out for it. So Brighton Rock, like I said, not a place, but a type of candy. But Brighton is a place, and that is the setting of our novel, and it takes place in 1930s. We are post World War. I mean, it's been a number of years since the Great War. However, the aftermath of World War One is still very much present in 1930. As a result of World War One, collectively around the world, there is a tremendous feeling of disillusionment. Never had there been this modern type of war with such casualties and horrors, and as a result, many felt betrayed by their leaders, their culture, their institutions, and there was a loss of belief in idealism, morality, love, and other such forces. So, in other words, there's this real sense of displacement and hopelessness that Green really captures in his setting. And this is really, I mean, this is the overall feeling of the time when this novel takes place and when this novel was written. Added to that, World War II, or not World War II, World War One left nearly every nation economically ruined. And for England in particular, post World War One meant the end of the vast, overreaching English empire created by Victoria. And people at this time are morally and financially bankrupt. So in 1938, when this novel is published, England is also on the cusp of entering a second world war with Germany. And why do I tell you this? Well, I tell you this because at the time, there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of paranoia, there's a lot of instability, both economically, socially, culturally. And with that instability in society, there is a heightened sense of fear, of dread, and as well as this kind of sense of paralysis and stagnation. And if we think about that in the context of our novel, it gives us a better insight into our characters and their motivations. 1930s also represents a change in social classes in England. We're entering well, we're leaving the old Victorian traditions behind and entering into an age of modernity with social hierarchies and women. And this matters because our main female character, Ida Arnold, she really breaks those traditional views of womanhood and this new kind of modern woman. And to caveat off of this kind of historical kind of context of the historical setting of our story, I really want to focus more specifically on the setting of where our story takes place, Brighton. And Brighton is a seaside resort about an hour's train ride from London. And the Brighton that Green presents is almost, like I said earlier, like a character in the novel. And the interesting thing to consider with Brighton as a place is its duality. There are these kind of two sides to the area, the bright, the clean, the wealthy side of town meant for tourists, that's full of commercialism like the pier, the cinema, the shops, pubs, areas full of opportunities for vice like drinking and gambling and promiscuity. But this side is really meant to attract visitors and to earn money because remember, we are in that kind of financial slump, that economic um, I mean, this is the way that they make their money for all intents and purposes. And on the flip side of that is everywhere else in Brighton where the kind of locals live. These areas are full of poverty, desperation, and think about what happens when people are so desperately poor. The crime rate raises. And because of this poverty and desperation, it opens us up to that kind of criminal underworld, the kind of underbelly, the seediness of the city that really permeates through our entire novel and through our entire setting. And because it's a tourist area, there is this kind of level of transience where people can come and go, and I mean, one day they're there, one day they're not. There's no kind of, I mean, that's really expected. And that's important, I think, when we look at Hale and his character. But, anyways, there's really no sense of permanency if you look at this kind of transient town. There's also a level of insider outsider mentality that comes with that transience, as in an us versus them mentality. And if you've ever lived in a place where there's lots of tourism, you can clearly see, like in my hometown, like if people have summer houses and all that kind of thing, and we call those people come heres, and the people who live there are people who stay here. So there's really kind of that division in the us versus them. But I digress. Anyways, but while this transience is noted with outside visitors, there's also this permeating feeling of stagnation with the locals. Brighton keeps them trapped, and the only hope they really have to rise above their poverty is to turn to questionable means. And we'll see that with Pinky and his desperation to get away from his childhood home and his turn to the gang to improve his situation. And we'll also see that with Rose's desperate desire to leave her parents' home, even if it means marrying a murderer. But the point I'm trying to make is that the setting or settings and its impact on the characters emotionally and physically is significant in understanding Green's subtleties, and our characters essentially then become products of their environment. So I have really quickly before I finish up some pictures of the various different parts of Brighton from the 1930s. Here we have this kind of touristy type thing, these kind of touristy type clean, pretty, bright, shining areas that are meant to attract versus the slums and the kind of neighborhoods that Rose and Pinky live, and places that they come from. I mean, there's this like when we get to Nelson Place and Rose's childhood home, I mean, you can just kind of uh, feel it, smell it. I don't know. It's interesting. So keep that in mind. I'll stop here because I know that I've gone on too long in this video, and I'll pick up with my final words before with the kind of introduction of the novel.